Encountering the original After Burner games in the arcade was an experience like no other. The games were already technologically impressive thanks to the powerful superscalar hardware that underpinned them, offering sprite effects and fluid gameplay that far exceeded the capabilities of home consoles of the era. But it went deeper than that. To start, just look at this cabinet. Even in still shots, it's obviously extremely impressive, and it would be difficult not to make a beeline the second you saw it in an arcade. Now, factor in the big screen, the flight stick controls, hydraulics throwing you around as you bank away from enemy missiles. The spectacle of it all remains irresistible to this day. There were ports and sequels over the years, but as the popularity of arcades diminished, the experience of After Burner became a distant memory. This was until 2006, when Sega graced the world with a true, modern-day sequel in After Burner Climax. After Burner Climax was developed for Sega's Lindbergh arcade hardware, an extremely capable board for the era. It was powered by a 3GHz Pentium 4 CPU, 1GB of RAM, and an NVIDIA GPU that was roughly the equivalent of a GeForce 6800. This was already fairly high-end hardware for the time, matching up well with the average gaming computer of the era. It also completely eclipsed the Chihiro architecture, Sega's most recent primary arcade stalwart. The other advantage was that, like other common hardware sets, developers were able to optimize their code specifically for the components of the Lindbergh kit, to produce visuals that were beyond what you'd normally expect from the sum of its parts. Early Lindbergh games like The House of the Dead 4 and Virtua Fighter 5 flexed the power of the board, with graphics that were a step ahead of the pack in the mid-2000s. It's no surprise then that After Burner Climax also found itself running on the Lindbergh hardware. The hardware was important, but to truly evoke the same emotions as the 80s releases, the cabinet needed to be equally special. Luckily, Sega came through big time, with huge screens, flight stick controls, and booming sound. There were 3 cabinets available. The standard one had no movement, the deluxe moved from side to side, and the super deluxe had the full range of movement. The cabinets really did their job, proving to be extremely eye-catching in the same way as the originals had been decades ago, and providing a breath of fresh air to many arcades that were becoming stagnant in the face of increasingly ambivalent audiences. Let's face it, whether it's the 80s, the 2000s, or today, it will always be almost impossible to resist the lure of a flight stick and hydraulic chair. The hardware available to players at home had become exponentially more powerful in the 90s and early 2000s. Several generations of console hardware had seen continuous development of 3D graphics, and home computers had gone from being a compromised gaming experience to the driving force for advanced visuals. This put After Burner Climax in an interesting position. The tastes of gaming audiences had changed significantly since the 80s, demanding more complicated games that they could enjoy for hours on end at home. Online games, cinematic RPGs, and big-budget first-person shooters had taken the limelight. After Burner Climax faced this adversity head-on, with the gameplay serving as an unapologetic throwback to the arcades of old. There were no slow-paced introductions here, no lengthy mid-mission cinematics, no complicated story to follow. You picked your plane, watched the takeoff sequence, and dove headfirst into adrenaline-inducing action. Fundamentally, the game felt just like the old After Burner games. The flight stick allowed your plane to move nimbly around the screen, enabling players to easily target hostiles while evading enemy missiles. There was just enough weight in the movement to make it feel like you were controlling a vehicle, especially when in one of the moving deluxe cabinets. One small difference from the original was an armor meter. This gave players a couple of hits before their plane went down, in a blaze of glory. This was only a minor reprieve though, as the game remained quite unforgiving to new players until they learned the various enemy tendencies and patterns. And it was fast. Blazingly fast. It's amazing how much detail was packed in, given that you barely get the chance to see most of it. The scenery flew by at a rapid clip, aided by subtle blur effects that all contributed to the incredible sense of speed. It could be overwhelming at first, especially for those trying to take in everything on the screen. In a similar way to the old games, the trick was not to get distracted by the scenery and explosions, and, instead, to keep an eye on the horizon at all times, waiting for specific enemy shapes and focusing on defensive maneuvers as much as attacking. The main addition to the gameplay was the climax mode. Filling up the meter, then hitting the button would slow down time and give the player enhanced offensive abilities. A lot of 2000s era games had some sort of bullet time. We were living in a post-Matrix era, after all. It felt earned in After Burner Climax though, as the sheer speed of the normal gameplay provided a great contrast with the dream state of the slow motion. It also provided a welcome, though short-lived, break from the relentless pace of the gameplay. There were multiple routes available through the game, similar to Outrun. Taking different routes would earn you different endings, adding a little bit of replay value to the game for the truly dedicated. Games like the original Afterburner came out at a very particular time in history, where 3D was not common and most sprite-based games were slower paced, extremely simple, or both. The speed and complexity of Afterburner's gameplay was eye-opening, as it pushed the sprite-based visuals to new heights and helped usher in a new era of games both in the arcade and at home. It also demonstrated that the arcades were light years ahead of the current consoles in terms of hardware, with few experiences at home even coming close for a decade or so. When Afterburner Climax landed in arcades in 2006, the context was completely different from when its ancestor was popular. Detailed 3D visuals were ubiquitous, having been the focus of console development for several generations. Development pipelines had also been streamlined, with many games using common libraries. Arcade games were often built with home releases in mind, or even on adapted versions of console hardware in the first place. This made the visual quality of Afterburner Climax even more impressive. In many ways, it was the visual representation of what was in the imagination of those who played the original game in the 80s. The plane models were extremely detailed. Landscapes were full of depth and colour, packed with character, despite their fleeting nature. There were moments when the game looked photorealistic, a tremendous achievement, especially given the distinctly unrealistic nature of the gameplay. The little details also added to the atmosphere of the game, from the reflection of the sun on the water, to the clouds of smoke billowing from your missiles as they launched towards enemy targets. Modern visual techniques allowed the lighting engine to add a cinematic quality to the game that really helped bolster its visual character. Watching the sun lazily peeking from behind a distant mountain, while light bounced off the shiny metal of your plane, added immeasurably to the game's wish fulfillment credentials. The most important part was how the game performed. Unsurprisingly, Afterburner Climax ran at a smooth 60 frames per second that kept things moving regardless of how busy the screen became. This was incredibly important, both to maintain the sense of speed, but also to ensure that the twitch-heavy gameplay was not interrupted. Afterburner Climax was already an unforgiving game at heart, but the fluidity of the visuals ensured that if a player died, it wasn't due to an errant dip in frame rate or loss of control. The visuals were paired with equally impactful audio. The sound effects are loud and piercing, with explosions galore and the roar of jet engines helping to immerse the player even more deeply into their airborne activities. The radio voices made famous by the original game are present here too, and are hugely nostalgic. Hearing the frenzied call of never fails to bring a smile to my face. The music plays a distinct second fiddle to the sound effects. It is there, and is largely inoffensive, but it's mostly drowned out by the voices and explosions rocking the cabinet. It's not bad, and hearing the electric guitar kicking in between stages was always nice to hear, but it never quite hit the highs of the theme from the original games. Luckily, the After Burner 2 soundtrack was actually available in-game as well, so you had the best of both worlds. The old After Burner games saw ports to almost every console and computer under the sun. Whilst After Burner Climax wasn't quite as pervasive, it still saw ports to a few different systems. The Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 versions were released digitally in 2010, almost 4 years after the arcade. Despite this delay, the game felt as fresh and addictive as ever, proving a perfect tonic to those who were burned out on the heavier games of the era and were looking for a more arcadey experience to distract themselves. The game's visuals were slightly enhanced, being converted to widescreen to match the more common resolutions of the era. There were some additional features added too, such as a score attack mode, online leaderboards, and the ability to access EX options. These options would be unlocked by reaching certain milestones and thresholds in the game, and allowed the player to do things like add extra continues or armor. At its core though, the game remained the same fast-paced, twitch-heavy arcade experience as before. It was polarizing for those who did not have much experience with these sorts of games, but a welcome change for players growing weary of the direction in which many modern games were heading. Sadly, After Burner Climax was delisted in 2014, so your opportunities to play either of these versions may be extremely limited. Interestingly, there were also mobile ports of the game to both iOS and Android. Reviewers at the time noted that the controls were surprisingly good, and the game, though cut down visually, was still an excellent representation of the arcade original. The arcadey nature of the game also proved to be a perfect fit for mobile gaming, as the short sessions suited the rhythm of the game to a T. Unfortunately, these versions have also been lost to time, as they too have been delisted. Under the glitz and glamour, After Burner Climax is a throwback to a simpler time. The adrenaline-heavy gameplay pairs perfectly with the exceptional presentation to provide an experience that evokes the same emotional response as the original arcade releases back in the 80s. It fits nicely amongst the other great Sega arcade revivals of the decade: Outrun 2, Sega Rally 3, and Virtua Cop 3. Well, maybe not that last one quite so much. Unfortunately, with the ports delisted, and arcades continuing to disappear around the world, After Burner Climax is becoming harder and harder to play. This is a tragedy, as it's an excellent game and a great representation of Sega's arcade philosophy. If you have an old Xbox 360 or PlayStation 3 with the game installed, treasure it like no tomorrow. And for those lucky enough to stumble upon the cabinet in some forgotten corner of an old arcade, treat it like the holy grail that it is. Also, please send me the address.